So thank you for the invitation to share, by the way. As Ron mentioned, my focus is on today in particular is on creativity and innovation. And my fascination is to share with you what is it about the way I happen to see the world and interact with it that might be interesting to you and might have something in common with you or not. So looking at creativity and innovation as a source of connection. So I'm going to ask you a question. And without being too analytical about it, I'd like you to just notice where you ask yourself the question and then just write it down and then let it go. Okay? So the question is, where does your body end? Where does your body end? So I'm going to give you like 30 seconds. And after you've written it down, just let it go. We're going to come back to it. But for now, just let it go. Very brief introduction to me. I have two kind of tracks of interaction with the world. One is my music. And I do music. I was a singer-songwriter for many years. I have, I think, 8 or 10 albums. But more recently, I would say the sound healing, sound alchemy, and now also sound empathy has come into my life as a way to explore how we experience our consciousness through sound. I also have an interest in helping other people have an understanding of themselves through their energy without being too new agey and also without being fully scientific. There's this sort of in-between ground where we look at how our energy experiences, how our energy interactions can be tracked by ourselves as a heuristic study, but also as an information source around what is actually going on in a situation. So those are my two websites. I have a gazillion influences, but there's ways that I have been educated by things that I have done and places I've been. So very briefly, the first three are institutions that I have either been educated in or have taught in. As Ron mentioned, creativity and innovation. At JFK, I did a master's degree in consciousness studies and answered a lot of the questions we were asked with text, but also with creative, more abstract, if you will, responses, creative responses. I learned a lot about who I am as an entity, as a being, through the forest where I grew up, which was in Epping in England, and also a particular beach, but these beaches and all land, of course, is related. So Aldborough, which is also in Suffolk in England, is the place where I wandered the stony beaches, listening to the sounds, listening to the complexity of sounds in my environment, the routines and the rhythms of the lifestyles there. It's a fishing town, so it was a massive education for me, and it brought me forward in ways that I wouldn't be me today without. So land and the elements and my imagination have kind of danced, talked, tussled, wrestled, and I have been fed by these things. Obviously, I have a mind. I'm stating the obvious here. I have a body and I have emotions. Those three things combined come into what we're going to touch on today. But again, none of this would mean anything if I didn't have curiosity. So from a human being perspective, our curiosity is a key quality that influences and affects how we perceive things, if we perceive things, and then what do we do with that? I'm going to ask three questions, and they're really just to exist. We don't have to specifically answer them. You're welcome to write them down or not. So the first one is, if how we perceive affects what we find, then how should we or do we relate to what we find? Another question is, what does it mean to sink into the complex system to which we belong, to sink into it and explore it with tactile questions? What does it mean to sink into the complex system to which we belong and then explore it with tactile questions? And finally, the question I live with, literally live with all the time: what do we belong to? I feel a need, an urge, an impulse, compulsion to locate myself systemically. And I'm curious about humans. How much are we focusing on that? As an artist and a healer and a human, my questions tend to be, am I a tree? Am I the ocean? Am I the wind? Am I my thoughts? Am I your thoughts? My sensory experience, my collective longing, our collective longing, and then where do we each end and the other begin? As Ron mentioned, there are ways of knowing. So dynamic emergence is a model of consciousness that came to me, that I collaborated with to bring into being and to share with others. I had a need for this. I wish I'd had this when I was a lot younger, because I grew up in a context, a social context, in a family context, where a lot of what and how we knew was rational. And yet there was this very emotional young girl, and I lived very much in the forest. So I was a sensory person, and I also could perceive subtle energies, but no one talked about it. So I didn't know what to do with that except try to ignore it, which is a very uncomfortable way to live. So dynamic emergence is proposing that we consider, take all those multiple intelligences from Howard Gardner, for instance, if you're familiar with him, and there are lots of them. You can really point to any way of looking at something and call it an intelligence, but the list gets long. But if we summarize it, then most ways of knowing, if not all, could be considered rational, emotional, and sensory. They are a cluster of their own, as you can see in the right. And then in the center of that is ourselves, choosing what to do with all this information and data that comes in. But perhaps the most important thing in terms of transcending the limits of repeating the past is our relationship to not knowing and our relationship to our intuition. So as each way of knowing has its own language, it generates a corresponding way of being. So with my mind, I can think. With my feelings, with my emotions, I can feel. And with my sensory capacity, I can sense, as I said, everything, depending on my skill level. So this feeds our imagination and our approach to things. This, I don't want anyone to feel like they have to remember all this. I'm more than happy to share this in a follow-up email, which I think Ron will be sending out, so that you can consider these at your leisure and take your time with them. But what I'm considering is that these ways of knowing that exist kind of here in my private space, they also exist in this nested hierarchies. And this is inescapable. But it's also the only reason I'm alive. So I am so much more than what my mind can perceive. I am what my body can relate to. I am what my emotions can sense, and all of those things. So these layers, there are courses on this. So that's why I'm not going to spend a ton of time on it, because it's its own rabbit hole. But we have this inner sense here. The bit where I get to decide what I believe, whether anyone else agrees with me or not, right? And then that influences the next encounter, this yellow band, which we call the outer res, because it's where people meet in formality, a transactional zone or a marketplace. So today, this would be, we're meeting in the outer res. We're creating a unique bubble of our own for this time. That influences the creative collective, what's possible next, or it's also known as just collective consciousness. And then that has to have a home. Where does that home come from? It's the planet. We live within the planet. We rely on the planet for sustenance and for a lot more. And then the planet needs a home, and that's the cosmos. The piece of this that I want to draw our attention to today is in this different color. It's our not knowing. I was blessed with a coincidental conversation with a pastor who happens to be an old friend. And I had this circle here in the design, and it was there for a long time before I knew what it was for. And when I had spoken to him about this model and I mentioned the knowing, he's like, well, Claire, remember the not knowing. And all of a sudden it was like all the lights went on, and I realized this circle that had existed in this design was about the not knowing, the beginner's mind. And that for humans, one of the greatest assets I think we can give ourselves is the humility to empty ourselves of what we know so that new information and new ways of knowing can actually come in. So again, this question, what do I belong to? Locating our belonging in a larger context. And creativity is an expression of belonging, and discovery as an expression of place. One of the things I do is sing. It makes me happy, and I think it makes me happy because it connects me to the planet and to the numinous. The energy of life, the liminal and the numinous. So my question, and this next slide it might become a bit scary because it's kind of got a lot in it, but again, it's just a reference point. But my question is, how did we get so far away from seeing life, land, and place as sacred? And these are the words. Ron and Todd have seen this, but I'm just going to quickly make everything visible. And then I'm just literally going to touch on this. Because really what I want to do is just stimulate some new thoughts for us to sit with together. Whatever emerges in each of us from that. I'm baffled by humanity's capacity by design to be like really, really intelligent, really creative, really kind, and really collaborative. And at the same time, there's some strange things going on within us that separate us. And actually, one thing I want to mention here that refers back to the rational, emotional, and sensory is that a proposal within dynamic emergence is that if any one of those ways of knowing dominates to the point that it is literally unable to be influenced by the other two, so if rational is full on and it has no relationship to sensory or emotional, then the choice is inverse. It becomes irrational. It makes irrational choices. And with the physical, with the sensory, if we're not influenced and informed by the emotional and the rational, then the shadow extent of that is that it can become violent or destructive. And with the emotional, if it's not informed by the rational and the sensory, then it can become sociopathic. And we've had leaders that are good examples of some of these things. So what's interesting to me is that I feel like some of these elements here are gateways of insight into a more expanded perception of self, which therefore becomes an expanded experience of relationship with that which is beyond and outside of this sphere of reference. So the numinous is the divine power in a place. When I'm being creative, when I'm really being creative, when I'm no longer just me, I, Clare, then I'm traveling. I'm traveling to other realms. And the liminal is part of that. The liminal is a reference in terms of how is it defined to boundaries and edges. So I love walking on the beach because it's a liminal space because you've got where the land and the water meet, where form and flow interact and things happen. So from a human perspective, it's a very exciting place to be. I'm going to touch on the word imagination. Ron introduced that as part of my focus, and it's true. Imagination is a very exciting word if you break it down this way. Magi, in terms of in the dictionary, its etymology, it means sorcerer or sorcery, alchemy, and astronomy. So I choose alchemy for the purposes of this conversation. And I, of course, here I am. So I alchemize, and then nation. So this entity here is a nation. It's a nation of cells. It's a nation of ideas and a nation of boundaries. And this is true of course, larger environments, whether it's Russia or the US or anywhere else. So when we use our imaginations, rather than them being something childish or childlike, which is something we are taught about when we're much younger, we're actually practicing our capacity to alchemize reality, to alchemize environments. So it's very, very, very important. It's our most important skill. We need it now more than ever because we have to move very fast together in some kind of coherence to shift the direction, the trajectory of our current destination, which is an Earth that will be unsustainable for life, especially for human life. So there's something about divinity with the numinous and the Fernweh and Sehnsucht, the two German words that refer to longing, really, and a feeling of displacement or a strange nostalgic memory for places we've never actually been. And I feel like these actually speak to this connectedness that we've lost touch with, but we haven't forgotten. So the proposal I'm thinking today is, what if we recreated ourselves as Temenos? Temenos is actually sacred land. It's a sacred space. So considering this a nation, if I thought of myself as Temenos, how would things change in my perception realms? So the numinous, this thing about the numinous is this place where change happens. We're each numinous, we're each Temenos. And we can companion this inner state of longing back to a sense of connection. That's kind of what I'm thinking about. So now I'm going to ask you again to please ask yourselves, where does my body end? And again, without analysis or judgment, where do you find yourself referencing that question within yourself?
You're asking us?
Yes, I'm asking you to just contemplate it.
But not to
We'll discuss it. We'll discuss it afterwards.
Okay.
Yeah. And a little bit later, I'm going to sing for a minute, and then I'm going to ask you that question again. So this is more than I can talk about possibly in the short time that we have for this part of today. But this consideration of belonging, and this is a reference to the colonial perspective versus the indigenous perspective. As a human, do I exist in a solitary boundary here? Do I exist as part of planet? Or do I perhaps exist as part of planet and relationship? And what does it mean? How does it affect my sensitivity, my capacity for love, and my creative reach, depending on whether I'm this, or this? And the question, what is your knowing bias, is something we could consider at another time, but it's really, that's more to do with Are you more rationally emphasized? Are you more sensory emphasized or more emotionally emphasized? Because, of course, that impacts the way you take in information and the way you need to take in information in order to make sense of things. So what am I tuning into when I'm being creative? One way of looking at this, and this is where Bohm pops in, David Bohm, is that there is an implicate and an explicate order to life. There's the not yet formed, and then that which has become formed, informed. So a while ago, not that long, actually, probably 2 or 3 months ago, I started painting energy balls. And they started off kind of like this. And I noticed that there was this eye in the middle that would often appear and look at me. And when I was teaching at San Francisco State, I would often say to my students, did you ever think that your life would look back at you? That you have an accountability with something that is real and alive, that is looking at you. And what is that? And what do we want to do with that emerging dynamic, that relational dynamic? And I'm going to show you just briefly, because I think it helps illustrate the process I went through of listening, because it's something I think we have to learn how to do more easily, more frequently, as if it's normal. So the energy balls that you saw at the beginning were like this, very dense, right? I could look at that and say, wow, my mind already knew what was there. I felt obliged to fill the space with what I knew. And the more I slowed down and listened for something on the other side of that piece of paper, the more space emerged as I painted. And my breathing changed. I started shifting my weight from my left to my right foot. And it was really physical. The whole experience was really surprising. And then I got nervous because I could feel an aliveness of connection. And it's like, who am I talking to? What is this? But the I remained, like this sense of something there with me, but on the other side, like Alice in the Looking Glass, in a way. And the more sparse it became, the more excited I felt, because I knew I was in a relationship with something that was more, that had things to tell me, right? That had things to tell me, and I wanted to listen. If I'm anything this life, it's a student. And I explored with the different colors. That felt important, and I started transitioning and using lots of colors. And the more sparse it became, I felt like the more room I was making at the table for this aliveness. And it was mesmerizing. So that's just to give you a sense of things. And these range, like this little one is 6 inches square. And then this is actually 18 by 24 inches. So that they range in scale. And that part wasn't really so relevant because the energy was the same. There are just 2 more slides. I want to share these thoughts with you because I know that Donella Matthews is well known to some of you. Let's remove that a sec. And I was so surprised by what she wrote because I know her to be, you know, a sort of professional businessy type person. That's her focus. But here she is in a paper that she wrote, and I can share the link with you to the paper. that systems thinking leads to another conclusion, and that there is plenty to do, but it's a different sort of doing. And I love that. I love this idea that there's a different sort of doing, because I'm talking about knowing and being, but that all results in doing. So that whole concept of that she's also talking about. So when we listen to what a system is telling us and discover how its properties and our values can work together, it's much bigger. It's going to be different from what we could produce by will alone. And that there's a way to dance with this that is super creative. And the innovations that we can come up with from a collaboration that expands past the human dimensions is, I feel like it has to guarantee in a way that it's going to be regenerative and sustainable, and in ways that we can't anticipate. It will be meaningful and it will make us safe again. So as she says, it requires our full humanity, not just our rational, but including our rational. So the intuition, the compassion, vision and morality. And I want to end with sharing you an excerpt from a piece I made after going to Scotland. So I travelled to Scotland at the end of 2019. I had a performance in Findhorn, and then I stayed up there, and I actually travelled for about 4 or 5 months, and I wandered around the lochs, up and down mountains, on the isolated Isles of Orkney. And I put it together with a piece with various, I recorded the sounds of the wind, and I took a lot of photographs, and it was just a very intimate experience of being in a really wild landscape, quite lonely and desolate, but deep, deep intimacy. And it's called The Mountains Breathe. I'm wondering, Ron, how much of this should I play? Because I don't know how long I've been already. Like 2 minutes, 3, 4?
Yeah, let me just check the time here. Yeah, I would say 3 or 4 minutes, probably, yeah.
Okay, hopefully there'll be a natural breaking point for that, so. Let's get these out of the way. And you are the trees. The mountain. So there's more to that, of course, and it runs into some spoken word. Before you take this back, Todd or Ron, I want to ask you all the final time.
Yeah.
Hold on. Can I just ask this final question, please?
Sure.
Where does your body end? Even just ask in your own minds. You don't have to write it down. But where does my body end, really? And why does that matter? That's more an intellectual question. So thank you.
Thank you. Wow. Taking us into the sacred. Wow.
I missed you all.
Yes, quite beautiful. Quite beautiful. A display of your artistry, for sure. And a nice compliment and compliment to Alex's presentation. Really, really wonderful. So, people can respond now, and